Somewhere beyond the sea, somewhere waiting for me, my lover stands on golden sands and watches the ships that go sailing somewhere.
So, we just had a major emergency. The boat caught fire. This was probably the single most dangerous, scariest thing that has happened to us in 25 years. We had a boat fire once before when the kids were little. That was worse. It was worse. But since then, this is probably the most worried I have been. As you know, we've been having fuel problems. We fixed some fuel lines. And there's something just in the back of my head says check the fuel lines this morning. And so I went down there to make sure that everything was okay with the fuel lines, and I found a little bit of a fuel leak. I asked Sam to go down and check out the fuel leak because the hoses felt just a little bit wet.
They weren't wet after a while when I had tested them. In fact, they were drier after they warmed up.
Right.
But
it was just a tiny bit of damage.
tiny, yeah.
And so Sam found a broken hose clamp. So we immediately got into the hose clamps to find a new hose clamp to go on there. And so Sam is trying to get the new hose clamp on, and all of a sudden I hear, fire, fire! So I go running to get the fire extinguisher, which is right by the steps, right here. And
which we had inspected before we left.
yeah, so
they're maybe
it's been a year and a half
out of date or something, but they're not bad.
And
we had them all inspected and taken care of at it.
Yeah, and we like this fire extinguisher because it came from Italy, but we had it completely rebuilt. I mean, completely taken apart, repressurized everything, tested, and it was fine. And it still shows plenty of pressure. It's fine, right? It doesn't feel solid. You can still feel the dry chemical moving around in there a little bit. And so I grabbed this and I pulled the pin and I pressed as hard as I could, and nothing happened. Meanwhile, you can still see the flames down in the bilge. And by the way, the flames are right next to the fuel leak where the diesel was dripping all over. And my son was down there with the diesel. Anyway, by the time I figured out this wasn't going to work, the fire was actually going out. And we started investigating the reason for the fire. And as it turns out, it was a burnt wire. And the circuit breaker blew with a short. And then, of course, just the casing on the wire continued to burn for a few moments and then went out.
Regardless if there was a short or what the problem was, they used the wrong gauge of wire. The entire point of a circuit breaker is to stop the electricity before the wire burns.
Yes, so we should have had wire that was able to handle the full amperage of the circuit that it was on, which means if we have 20 amps going to the aft cabin, that wire should have been able to handle 20 amps.
And if I recall, those are 15 amp circuit breakers, so it should have been a 15 amp wire.
At least.
At least.
If not more, right? And what's more, when we looked at the wire that was burned, it was quite literally an old extension cord wire. Which should have had, by the way, it should have had enough amperage to be able to flow through the wire. But
well, that's not the case. There's a lot of cheap extension cord wire that is not rated for 15 amps, which is the standard, but 10 or 5.
Right.
There's another thing that hasn't been mentioned, that nothing was on.
It turns out that the circuit that shorted out was all of the connections in the aft cabin. So our 2 fans on the starboard side, 2 fans on the port side, the overhead lights for the individual beds, bunks, and the overhead light in the aft cabin itself. Now we have to figure out why they used an extension cord to wire the entire aft cabin.
And figure out where the extension cord goes, and beyond that, there was a problem.
We have to figure out what caused the short in the first place. But now, because that entire area is covered with diesel, we can't take apart the electronics or the wiring until all that diesel's cleaned up, because I'm not going to risk another spark or a short on wires that might be covered in diesel.
Do we have more wiring for you to use?
I don't think we have 15 amp wire, but we got plenty of other wire.
Yes, we have more wire we can use. And if nothing else, I can wire the back together, but I'd rather not do that. So I want to trace this piece of extension cord wire that was run from somewhere in the fuse panel all the way back to the aft cabin wiring and figure out where that junction is. I don't know where that is.
Okay. And it just seems like there's always something else that goes wrong, and it's just going to take another week. Just another week, and then we can leave.
Another week, and it's always something.
And we're here now.
One of the things that we had to do, the fuel line that was used to go from the aft tanks up to the manifold where we split them off, is much larger than this. In fact, it's a very nice fuel line, but the diameter of the hole is too small.
This is at least the right diameter fuel line designed for diesel.
Yes. So this is a good fuel line. There's nothing wrong with this. And there's really nothing wrong with the line that was there, except that the hole was too small. So in order to prevent the diesel from spilling, we did something that everybody's going to cringe at. But I'm going to tell you, when you're in a third world country, you kind of do what you have to do to make things work. So what I did to make the hole bigger, because there was plenty of rubber on this larger hose, I mean a lot, I actually took a drill and I ran the drill down in the hole, pulled it out, ran it back down, pulled it out, ran it back, until I had cut the tube with a hole big enough down 1 inch that we could get it onto the hose barb. So that is something that you can do if you're careful, and it does work. But remember, you have a reduced hose thickness when you do that.
I'm also dubious about what this hose has 3 walls.
Yes.
There's the outer wall, the inner wall, and then there's a middle wall. I have no clue what that middle wall is made of. The outer wall and inner wall are very clearly rubber for diesel.
Yes. Now I was very careful because you could see the multiple layers. So I was very careful with the drill to cut with it, not just to rip it, to cut with it, and then get all the little pieces out by continuing to turn while I pulled it out. And I got a lot of the pieces of rubber out, and they were nicely cut, and the inner piece was smooth, because otherwise, if there's any scoring, it'll never seal right.
And then after we cut that with a drill bit
I
blade,
chamfered the edge with a razor blade just a little bit so that it would go on the barb and I could push it up on there. So that is something that can be done. You can get a drill bit and you can make the hose bigger. But now the inner wall is half the thickness that it was before. I didn't go into the middle layer, I just went into the inner wall. So we're probably going to rerun that fuel line with a better fuel line. And after having a fire on the boat, now we have to get rid of these fire extinguishers because I couldn't press it down. There's a little pin in here that you're supposed to be able to press down, and it simply would not go down. Now we have other fire extinguishers. I could have got another one out of a drawer if it had kept burning, but that was pretty frustrating. So check your fire extinguishers, folks. The serendipitous thing of this whole event is, if we hadn't have been working on the fuel at that very moment, this little thing could have sparked off at some other point, and with the diesel leak, I could have had diesel on the wire and we could have had a really big fire. That's it for now. We're going to take a break and we'll figure this out in a few hours.
GoPro stop recording.
Hey folks, like, subscribe, tell your friends. It really does help, and it helps the channel grow, it helps us get higher in the search engines, and if you do feel like you can, please donate and help us out on the journey and help us restore this boat.
Well, we went to start our engine to make sure that everything was going okay. We started it just last week because we started every week or so, and she wouldn't start.